Child labor presented barriers to education and good health, but with the help of many people, they broke the barrier to change our nation for the better. Child labor and poverty are inevitably bound together, and if you continue to use the labor of children as the treatment for the social disease of poverty, you will continue to have both poverty and child labor to the end of time. Grace Abbott. In 1790, when the Industrial Revolution began in America, many families moved to the big, burgeoning cities to be a part of new advancements. Due to the benefits parents and companies were receiving from the labor of children, the practice quickly escalated. When exposure to the dangers of overworking and unhealthy conditions created a barrier for proper education and healthcare, the National Child Labor Committee and various organizations sought to break this barrier by petitioning and rioting in the streets until Congress passed laws protecting them. Even after Lewis Hine exposed the hazards of labor with pictures of dangerous working conditions of many children, most employers chose to ignore him. However, people soon realized that having good health, a proper education, and perhaps starting their careers later in their lives would be best for the children.
America's Industrial Revolution began in Massachusetts but spread to other states such as New York, Georgia, Maine, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and Ohio. As new ideas and methods spread, millions of children were put to work in extremely dangerous conditions that were not only harsh but life-threatening as well. Some children worked in professions such as chimney sweeping and coal mining, which served for a high risk in both long and short-term injuries and health complications of working children's futures. Not to mention, these children, who were sometimes very young, worked in factories running large machines often twice their size. By 1870, over 750,000 children under the age of 15 were working in factories and mines. Most children working were manipulated by factory owners to work 12 to 14 hours with very short, if any, breaks, which would quickly drain their energy. Working environments were also quite crowded with children using dangerous machinery. Most of the overcrowding in these workspaces were only beneficial for the factory owner who wanted more work done in less amounts of time. Children will also often get ill, for hygiene was not prioritized at all. Even so, as workers were removed from farms and home workshops turned into urban areas from industrialization, children were preferred, for they were viewed as more manageable, cheaper, and less likely to strike in factory owners' eyes. This was clearly a main motive for factory owners to hire children with less experience, skill, and strength than adults. Severe exploitation in the child working industry also led to physical, psychological, intellectual, social, moral damage, and occasionally death. It also didn't help that many tasks children were assigned to were monotonous, which made it prone for them to make risky mistakes.
In the early 1900s, people began to realize that it wasn't safe for children to be working in such hazardous conditions, so many took a stand. Many parents, teachers, labor groups, and advocates began to form organizations that had a common goal of ending child labor. In 1899, the National Consumers League was formed. In 1904, the National Child Labor Committee was founded. The resulting network of organizations dedicated to stopping child labor demonstrates that people finally wanted to stop child labor because they realized that the children were being manipulated in an unjust way. The objective of the National Child Labor Committee, a private social action group, was to exploit the harm of child labor in society because they believed that children deserve a healthy and happy childhood. Their goal was to determine why child labor was an issue and to prevent it from becoming a bigger problem by lobbying state by state for laws protecting children to be passed. The National Child Labor Committee felt that by publicizing child labor, they could stop the problem from spreading further and becoming an even bigger issue. Lewis Hine was a sociologist and photographer who believed in exploiting child labor and its dangers. He used photographs of children's working conditions, along with other pictures, to show how bad child labor was for children. When the National Child Labor Committee hired him in 1904, they went all over the country to gather photos of the working children and displayed them in newspapers, at public meetings, at state fairs, and at many social gatherings all over the nation, finally exposing the harm child labor caused. Many were appalled by Hine's findings because they made people realize how dangerous child labor was for children to be working in such terrible conditions and how hard their jobs were. After child labor was exposed by Lewis Hine, more and more people began to join protests and organizations. Grace Abbott, a social worker, educated others about regulating child labor and improving children's rights. As the director of the Child Labor Division in the U.S. Children's Bureau, she administered the Keating-Owen Act, which limited the employment of underage children. Even after the act was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, Abbott continued to fight for child labor rights by securing child labor clauses in many war good contracts passed by Congress. Another labor activist was Mother Jones. She campaigned and led protests with the United Mine Workers Union in Pennsylvania to help children working in mines and railroads. The first step to bringing child labor to an end was to form organizations that protested to end child labor and exposed the harm to the country in order to protect children.
Throughout the journey to end child labor, many federal laws and acts were necessary, along with state enforcement. In 1916, the National Child Labor Committee helped back up an act known as the Keating-Owen Act to be ratified. The Keating-Owen Act stated that no producer, manufacturer, or dealer shall ship or deliver for shipment in interstate or foreign commerce any article in which 30 days prior to the time of the removal of such product therefrom children under the age of 16 have been employed or permitted to work more than 8 hours in any day or more than 6 days in any week. However, the act, which meant that products made by children under the age of 16 could not be shipped or sold in the U.S., was never enforced when the Supreme Court overruled the act, declaring it unconstitutional in the Hammer v. Dagenhart 247 U.S. 251 case of 1918. The Supreme Court declared the act as unconstitutional because since child labor was not considered as interstate commerce, only states could manage it. This case included Reuben Dagenhart's father, Roland, and W.C. Hammer, a United States attorney. Roland has sued on behalf of his freedom to allow his 14-year-old son to work in a textile mill. The Supreme Court stated from the 10th Amendment, there is no power vested in Congress to require the states to exercise their police power so as to prevent possible unfair competition, which meant that Congress did not have the power to regulate and equalize trade. Between 1918 and 1938, the National Child Labor Committee worked with individuals such as Lewis Hine and Mother Jones to continue to raise awareness of child labor in the government. Another important regulation was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This act stated that children could not work in industries engaged in commerce or in the production for commerce. This meant that even though there were versions of child labor to be against the law, there was a variety of unlawful child labor forms such as child volunteers and child newspaper deliverers. The Fair Labor Standards Act asserted that the work children employees were doing deserved a minimum wage standard and overtime pay if working for 40 hours or more. Last but not least, the Walsh-Healey Public Contracts Act of 1936 established minimum wage, maximum hours, and safety and health standards for work on contracts in excess of $15,000 for the manufacturing or furnishing of materials, supplies, articles, or equipment to the U.S. government or District of Columbia. This act signifies that many people in the government were against child labor. Evidently, they did not want to encourage child labor by buying products made by children. With the help of many necessary acts and regulations, child labor was finally able to be brought to an end. The Fair Labor Standards Act was not declared unconstitutional, unlike the Keating-Owen Act. Between 1929 and 1941, the Great Depression had a powerful impact on working conditions because it increased the supporters of the child labor movement, and Francis Perkins and President Roosevelt supported it.
The barrier of child labor left vulnerable children unprotected and in perilous conditions. Fortunately, with the aid of many organizations and the government, the children and their supporters were able to break this barrier and get proper education along with better health care.
The increase in the usage of child labor occurred because it was cheap and provided good profits for businesses and families.
The ending of child labor brought a new beginning for the children of our nation. In 1997, Alexis Herman, a U.S. Secretary of Labor, said, "If we can't begin to agree on fundamentals such as the elimination of the most abusive forms of child labor, then we really are not ready to march forward into the future."